Hello, my name is Norman Valdez, and I welcome you to the Brain Trainer AI for Social Impact podcast, where we feature various guests across the span of the AI space.
And my name is Alex Tveit. In this episode, we have the pleasure of welcoming Mark Abbott, who is the Director of Tech Stewardship at Mars Discovery District. In this role, Mark champions Tech and AI Stewardship, which is a co-owned initiative which continuously discusses, refines, and imagines new ways to shape technology for the benefit of all.
We welcome you to listen to this insightful episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of the Brain Trainer AI for Social Impact. And today we have the honor of having Mark Abbott. And hello, and we're gonna get Alex and just kick us off.
Yeah, no, it's been great following and alongside Tech Stewardship for the last few years, but I'm really interested in exploring what led into the creation of the Tech Stewardship as well as what, in terms of your own personal journey, what inspired you to champion the cause of Tech Stewardship?
Yeah, thank you both for having me today. And great question to start with, because I have my own personal origin story in this work that was very fortunate to kind of put me in a position to work in formal ways to help develop the concept of tech stewardship. But one of the things I've found is that my story is by no means unique in that, I was an engineer, did my engineering degree at UBC, was working in kind of more traditional engineering career pathway in consulting engineering based in Vancouver. And like I've learned, a lot of people had questions about sort of, the bigger context for our work. We were always sort of head down, what's the next project, get the next project, do it well, move on to the next project, grow the company, all super important objectives and things that we really need to focus on. And we were always so busy and kind of driving for the next things that we didn't earn a lot of spaces to kind of pause and ask some of these bigger picture questions and say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure about this decision we're making, or something here is feeling a little bit uncomfortable. It was always just kind of go, 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 go. For me, my kind of origin story, I wound up getting involved with a nonprofit called Engineers Without Borders Canada. And all of a sudden there was this group of people who were asking bigger questions. It's like, well, wait a minute, what's the world you want to see? And how does your work contribute to that? And so I kind of went from dipping a toe into volunteering with this nonprofit alongside my leadership role in this consulting firm. After 4 or 5 years of volunteering, got to the point where I was probably doing more work on my volunteer work than my high paid, cushy leadership role in engineering. So for me, I wound up switching career paths and leaving sort of industry to join the nonprofit world, and moved from Vancouver to Toronto to join the executive team of Engineers Without Borders. That led for a few years, kind of looking and exploring different ways at sort of how to create change in the world. After a few years of that, we had this idea of launching something called the Engineering Change Lab, where we took a social labs approach. We convened a microcosm of the engineering profession in Canada to look at how the world was changing and how the engineering profession needed to evolve itself to kind of live up to its higher potential. So at that point, it's very engineering kind of mindset on everything. After a few years of doing that work with the Engineering Change Lab, we were getting into some of the deeper, more philosophical questions. And it turns out, the strengths of engineering become kind of its weaknesses. Like, we're practical problem solvers. We don't have time for all that philosophical crap about who we are and our place in the world. Just give us the problem and we'll solve it. Which is a strength until you overplay it to the point that the engineering profession often does, and kind of has an aggregate where there's almost a sort of lack of that kind of more philosophical level of, wait a minute, what is engineering? And as we started to come back to some of those more foundational questions, we said, well, in a basic sense, engineering is really just the process of creating technology. Okay, well, if that's engineering, what's technology? Well, the great thing about reestablishing that kind of link was, the field of philosophy of engineering is really great and starting to grow, but it's still pretty nascent compared to the field of philosophy of technology. There's a lot of incredible scholarship and deep thinking about philosophy of technology. So by kind of reconnecting engineering to technology, it brought us into this larger conversation out of the engineering silo where there's engineers talking to other engineers about the future of engineering, into this much larger conversation of tech and society. We were sort of pulled into that larger conversation around 2017 when the first Facebook scandal, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, happened. So it was a little bit of fortuitous timing, because it was this moment, I would say one of the early moments, and there's been several over the last few years, where I think there's a sort of wave of society really questioning the nature of our relationship with technology. And so we were sort of working as the Engineering Change Lab, starting to kind of ask questions in this larger tech and society spaces. And the basic question was like, hey, we've all been to the movies and seen how this can go wrong. what's it going to take to make sure that tech and tech innovation is actually shaping a world we want to see? So it was asking questions like that led us to this concept of tech stewardship.
Yeah, and I just want to. I think I told you this privately, but I also want to say openly to the public that how influential you have been just directly for me as Norman Valdez, and this absorbing and meeting all of this. Insights that you bring in with your experience with the tech stewardship. With we're gonna ask you about AI stewardship as well, but I think just primarily with what Mars did with that Impact AI, which was it like this year?
It was
Just
in February. There was a Discovery District where we're now based. I ran its first Impact AI conference in February. Yeah.
it feels like it was years, and the reason why the reason why it was years because just so much has happened, especially when you just think about AI. But like, just you sort of just influencing me to attend that event was so like I had like a number of catalyst events or situations and people that I meet, but like that was one of them, and you have been one of those people that I have spoken to that has been sort of the catalyst for me to just really think and really recognize the significance of AI, or what is AI in terms of like what is it doing to society, and just thinking about like the harnessing. And I think I even used one of your slides. I kind of repurposed in a way, reimagined one of the slides you had about like how organizations and people tend to work in silos, and we need to like work together and like harness the power of AI. So I guess kind of like what I want to get from you is and start to talking about like just how big of a thing is AI. Now I start to reflect about that, because I think you very well know, and we spoke about this when you were telling me about tech stewardship, and how like AI can just not just be a part of the tech stewardship, because it's so big it kind of reserves its own focus, right? So can you speak a little about like that, like tech stewardship? And I think we want to talk about the engineering lab again, but like if you can just speak about like, a little bit about tech stewardship and like the transitioning into AI and just importance of AI overall. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And first off, thank you for the compliment. And also, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable in that because as virtue of my role as director of engineering change lab and the tech stewardship initiative, I think often I'm the visible manifestation of what is actually a very collective amount of work. And as I mentioned before, what we've found over the years, we've had hundreds of leaders and hundreds of organizations contribute to this exploration and shaping of tech stewardship. So part of my role is to try to distill some of that and share it. So people I think often mistakenly associate it with something that came magically out of my head, but I'm just part of a community that's doing this. And to kind of link that to the question you're now asking about AI, it's like, and your previous question about my origin story, it turns out my origin story is nowhere near unique. I'd say it's actually more the norm than the exception, that people feel conflicts within their and they often don't have a space to talk about those tensions and those conflicts in a productive way. It's like, oh, we just got to get this done. The CEO asked for this. We just need to kind of rush, right? And I think AI in particular, like there's elements I think of AI that are similar with other sort of tech stewardship challenges of the past, but there's elements that are brand new, right? And of course, one of the things that's new is the scale and the pace is just obviously quite remarkable. And so this almost I don't know what the right word is. It's almost like a compulsion, or it's like, we all feel this, like, we got to go fast. We got to go fast. We got to we can't be left behind. We feel like we're getting swept away or left behind. Right. And I think that's really contributing to even less time to really talk about the tensions in a more fundamental way. It's like, oh yeah, something's bothering me here. But if I stop and contemplate and reflect on that and try to connect with other people, it's going to be too late. And so I think there's a really human emotion in there that there's a lot of differences with the new AI wave, but I think that's one of the ones that's really important, and almost a little bit of at a moment in time when you could argue we most need critical reflection in order to guide wise action, more and more things are squeezing out time and space for that critical reflection and engagement with others.
I just want to follow along those lines. And their origins of tech stewardship is not even digital technology, it's the wider technology stewardship. But leading into where, as you talked about, the pace is going quicker and quicker, and a lot of organizations are not being able to keep up, and especially sectors such as nonprofit, social impact, philanthropy, that are often lagging behind on existing technology, not talking about AI, for instance. As you're moving from tech stewardship to AI stewardship, how has that journey been for you and for tech stewardship overall? Because it's a different environment dealing with different audiences that need different communication strategies and so forth, while you're trying to be a generalist with finding a layer of tech stewardship for AI. So I'm just wondering, how difficult has that been in readjusting into the pace of AI, for instance?
Yeah, an analogy we use a lot to kind of understand the last 5 or 6 years is a comparison back to like the 1960s and the early stages of the environmental movement. So, looking back, 1960s is when society started to awaken to the nature of our relationship with nature. And even the word nature started to evolve, and it kind of opened up a whole new way of seeing things that then created brand new professions and all sorts of like initiatives and activities. Pre 1960s, if you'd ask someone about the environment, it was, oh, we try not to make a mess. And then the 60s, we kind of said, wait a minute, humans are having this huge impact on the Anthropocene and all of the. And so a first step is always that awakening. We see, like starting back in 2017 with Cambridge Analytica and a bunch of other events over the last 5 or 6 years, we think it's a 1960s moment where people are starting to awaken to the nature of our relationship with technology, which of course is not just an analogy. It's actually the same story, just another chapter. It's like, you can think of our environmental, our relationship with our natural environment as being sort of mediated and shaped by technology. So it's all kind of linked, but we see these sort of like moments that are kind of drawing this like larger kind of awakening. And of course, AI just really kind of since ChatGPT really was a huge step change in kind of the awakening, because there's something about AI in particular. Like we've been telling stories about AI since long before we had the technical capability. And now I think part of what's captured people's emotions is like, wait a minute, those stories we've been talking, like going back to Frankenstein and all of these things, and even before, are starting to look eerily kind of like they're actually, it's the early stages of happening or are already happening. So I think there's something about the topic of AI that has captured people's attention early. Like you think back on some of the other tech transformations and the problems that happen, like social media, which again is related, AI and social media are tied. But if you think of the first Facebook scandal and AI, we went from social media being seen as a good or benign thing to, over the last several years, wait a minute, understanding the attention economy and all of these different things. But we were a long ways down that road before people started seeing the problems, before they were broadly known. Whereas with AI, one of the differences is it's captured people's imagination very, very early on, which has at least created space, I think, for these conversations and for things to happen. From a practitioner point of view, behind the scenes, several years there of talking about tech stewardship and doing things, it, in the words of our colleague, Martin Ryan, he sort of said it was like kind of a barren landscape. Like we had to kind of make the case for change, and there weren't that many other kind of initiatives, and where they were kind of pocketed or focused. All of a sudden now with AI, you don't have to make the case anymore. People are worried and they're concerned. And all of a sudden there's 1,000 different initiatives and takes on things, which is amazing. And so it's sort of like, now how do you harness that energy of the interest and the concern around AI to make sure we're putting in place all the things you need to ensure that it's creating a world we want to see? And of course, policy and regulation and investment and all of those things are part of it. What we're saying with tech stewardship is this thing that we sort of came to over the years through the work of the Engineering Change Lab and then the Tech Stewardship Initiative. There's something about our own personal views of technology and our practices around it that so far has tended to get de-emphasized, right? It's more policy and investment and training. All those things are critical, but I think we also need this ingredient of our managing our own kind of personal relationships with technology and our own behaviors and actions, whether that's as a citizen or an engineer or a lawyer or a policymaker. Like sometimes we find ourselves in a greater position of influence, but everyone is shaped by technology and has an opportunity to shape technology. And we think we need to keep driving that, like this wave of awareness. So kind of like with the environment, like people realized in the 60s that, yeah, we need all of these big laws and everything, but we actually are all in relationship with the environment and we all have an opportunity and a responsibility. I think we needed to kind of drive that awareness on technology a little bit more and give people more utility to be able to exercise that agency.
Yeah, and then going over with that is that the name of this podcast is Brain Trainer AI for Social Impact, and Brain Trainer is an idea of a platform that is centered about education. And just having spoken actually earlier today with another technology leader, I had the pleasure of speaking, and we speak about how important it is, the concept of education right now, simply because at the speed at which we're going in terms of like the developments, things are changing, new innovations are coming, and as I always say, we're gonna see very different things coming in the fall. Can you speak a little bit about, just from your position right now, your leadership position as a technology leader yourself, what are some of the things you've been observing or thinking about when it comes to what leaders in general, and doesn't need to be technology leaders, need to think about or worry about or consider when it comes to being educated about AI and what is happening right now, what is coming? Because just to give you a little bit of my perspective is that, to me, in order for a leader to understand what would be actionable, they do have to get, from my perspective, a baseline understanding of what is AI. They don't have to be expert. Doesn't need to get to the level of like software engineer, expert level. But I think from my perspective, they need to get to a baseline understanding of what is AI, so that from that baseline understanding, they can actually, as leaders, make decisions, change policy, upskill their staff, etc. What are some of the things you have been observing, both as a leader yourself and other leaders, and in the context of education and AI?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, totally agree with you that one way of saying it is I think there's a massive information asymmetry right now. There's a small number of people who really understand AI, where it's going, and like at a technical kind of level of detail and everything. And then there's everybody else who's kind of like, either excited to kind of catch up and find things, or terrified and wanting to kind of put their head in the sands. And so at this moment in time, I think there's a huge information asymmetry. But I think that in the range, and so absolutely, we need to work on that awareness of what's possible, what's becoming possible, and everything. I think what we can add on to that is the deeper level. Is we all have a worldview that we've developed in our own kind of formation, like where we've grown up, influences on us, maybe religion, professions have kind of all shaped this sort of thing that guides our actions day to day. And given the big impact technology is having on all of our lives, I would argue that all of us have a tech view too that is evolved and shaped, but almost none of us have made that explicit. It's like, when we decide whether or not to let our children have a tablet, or we decide whether or not, when we're excited or not excited about this new AI thing at work, it's being informed by our tech views as a subset of our larger worldviews. But most of the conversation doesn't happen at that kind of deeper reflective level. It's like, what's this thing? How can I use it tomorrow? If I don't use it, someone else is going to. It's kind of all of this, it's at the activity level without the deeper reflective level. And so with tech stewardship, what we're trying to do is combine those two things. And when we don't do that, what happens is a lot of the dominant tech views of the people who create and scale technology, Silicon Valley, particular leaders within Silicon Valley, wind up sort of winning the day and being privileged, because it's those views that shape the technology and shape the rollout of the technology and feel kind of like a steamroller. I know with both of you, Norman and Alex, like we've been looking at that exploration of sort of the nonprofit world and the tech world, right? And in those meetings, you can feel sort of one of the big ones is pace, right? It's like, well, like the Silicon Valley, move fast and break things, disruption, all of these different, and the nonprofit's like, well, wait a minute, how is this going to affect the stakeholders and the community holders? And both are kind of true, but they're two worldviews based in two different contexts. I think more time actually talking about what that is and seeing the tension there as not as something to be resolved and like we're all going to agree on one shared. No. We have different contexts. It's different worldviews, but if we can be more explicit about our different world or tech views, then we can be more effective at that higher kind of activity level, because we understand the tensions not as things to be one way or the other is solved, but actually as a source of creative shape technology in a different way. I'll give you an example, not for the nonprofit world, but as we're shaping some of our new programming on AI stewardship, one of the leaders we're working with is from the financial sector. So we were exploring this concept of worldviews with them, and we were saying, okay, well, how would you characterize the tech view of the financial sector? And how is it different from, say, maybe the Silicon Valley tech view? And his point was, well, Silicon Valley, the incentives are to move fast and break things, disrupt things, exponential growth, which, is, you can understand why that's the perspective of Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of strength to that perspective. The financial sector is really selling trust and stability, right? So, through that lens, the role of the financial sector on tech is to take the cutting edge disruptive tech and make it safe and trustworthy enough for financial markets. And, as I was peeling it into with him, so is that your organization, and how's your organization different than others? And he's with a bigger kind of leading organization. But he's, well, if you're a crypto startup, you're going to have a slightly different perspective on that than if you're a bank. But when you take a moment to actually explain that as the worldview and what's going on, it's actually really empowering when you start getting in these other conversations where, either internally in that person's organization, it's like, oh, this person joined our company from Silicon Valley and this person joined from government. And they're always kind of pulling, like, we're going too fast, we're not going fast enough. Instead of that being a tug of war, if more time has been sort of spent being explicit about that sector's tech view and that organization's tech view, then you can more often leverage the energy in that tension for positive innovation as opposed to like pulling itself apart.
I like it that you said innovation, because I was going to do a follow-up question, and it's specifically about that, because you are coming from Mars, and Mars is being one of the major innovation hubs in Canada. From your perspective, what would be like the thing that we're lacking right now when it comes to the innovation around AI? Because as you both know, as a lot of listeners know, like AI came out of Canada, right? We have a lot of the godfathers of AI here, and Elliot Sutskever did his PhD, with here at U of T, co-founder of OpenAI. So what are we lacking right now when it comes to the innovation space in Canada, and what is your view on like can we do anything to catch up, or what is it that we can do in Canada in order to be prosperous, because we have a long road ahead when it comes to AI innovations. So is it too late? Did the train already leave the station? Like what is your perspective on that?
I think, I don't know how to bridge the metaphor. The train's in the process of leaving the station. I don't think it's too late, but I think we have a huge challenge. And here's the nature of the challenge is I think our, modern Western society kind of, capitalist, democratic, tech driven. I think if we think in terms of both and, we need both and in a lot of situations. We need both critical reflection and wise action. I'd say at the moment, as a society, we're really biased towards the like action, move fast, break things, and not as good at sort of the critical reflection side. It's like here's another metaphor. I have a friend who works in Formula One, right? And Formula One race cars, are marvels of modern technology and engineering and everything, right? And I think to the layperson, they're like, oh, it's how fast they go. But when you talk to people who know the sport, it's actually not how the top speed is not the impressive thing. It's the ability to brake and corner and shift, right? And I think that with our modern kind of dominant unspoken tech views that are kind of shaping a lot of the world is a lot about just pushing the top speed without building our ability to corner and shift and adjust. And so we don't have the critical reflection part of the stewardship capacity is massively underinvested in. And therefore, we shouldn't go as fast until we get better at cornering kind of thing at a high level. And what does that look like in general is it's the ability for our communities and organizations to make those things, but even at a very personal level, at an individual level, how well are we each individually stewarding our own relationship with technology? And obviously the sort of the green bin of this revolution, like famously in the 60s, this idea of the green bin kind of helped people see how they could all play a role in recycling around the environmental movement. I think, the obvious one these days is our screens. We all have a relationship with our screens. And I bet you, well, I won't, almost nobody I talk to feels totally good about the relationship with their screens and how they're kind of moderating that. Now, it's not in isolation, right? Like my relationship with my screen is affected by decisions made by the companies and by regulators and everything too, right? And so it's not by accident that a lot of people feel conflicted about their relationships with their screens, but it's a very visceral kind of, personal human level thing about how intentional am I about thinking about the life I want to leave and what's important to me, and then translating that into my own personal decisions around my screens. And that same dynamic is the same thing that we need to build, that same capacity in ourselves as in our organizations, as in our communities, if we want to harness sort of all of this incredible potential of AI and make sure it's taking us towards the world we want to go. So what gives me a bit of optimism about it is what we were talking about before, is what's a little different about AI versus some of the past tech transformations is the degree to which it's captured our imagination early. So at least there's the potential, try to get that going early and build some of that capacity. I think the later we build that capacity, the more times we're going to go off the track and hit the wall.
I just wanted to, what you just mentioned, that it captured our imagination early. We just wrote an article around the imaginary crisis and the fact that similar, and I'll draw upon the analogy that you did between the 60s and environmentalism, climate action, and AI. There's a wonderful piece, as well as a book, or at least a longer piece, by Jeff Mulligan around the imaginary crisis, where often, especially become mainstream media and so forth, because of whether or not you call it clickbait or getting people's attention, they use doom and gloom and getting that in our face, not only through mainstream media, but social media, hampers our ability to see a positive future. In certain instances are around climate action because of that, and you see a whole generation having a mental health issues, speaking to youth around climate action. We're just seeing the same thing evolving with AI now. So how can we, when we have a need for diversity in voices, and for us, how do we move a sector or sectors from being reactionary in their understanding to being around the table? How do we make sure that we ignite that positive imagination in a diverse set of voices when it's really crucial, so that we can together imagine a future that's beneficial and intentional?
Yeah. For me, the heart of it is actually around our relationship with tensions. So I think in our modern society, we've been sort of conditioned or socialized to believe that tensions are a bad thing. Oh, tension, we need to resolve that. We need to come to an agreement where we agree on everything, right? It's one way of looking at things. But if instead we cultivated a way of looking at things that's like, all right, I have my own tech view. You have your tech view. Silicon Valley has a tech view. That's natural. We're going to have different views because of our different contexts and our different, a variety of different factors. That's not a bad thing. That's not something to be solved. That's actually a source of potential creative energy to drive things forward. Like if we engage with that tension in a productive way, rather than trying to like, oh, you disagree with me, I have to win you over. Like that energy can pull us apart and create division, polarization, like, obviously in politics. Like I think there are a lot of things in our society right now that are pulling us towards polarization and either or, and I win, you lose kind of mindsets, right? And a lot of it is in this concept of our orientation towards tension. If we can flip that around towards, a curiosity, okay, this is my tech view. Why is your tech view that way? And what's the strength of the way you're seeing it? Why does it make sense in your context versus mine? The nonprofit sector in Silicon Valley coming together to think about AI and nonprofits, right? It's like there's a different orientation, a willingness to accept that tensions are not only inevitable, they are actually important and useful if we think of the tension as that source of creative energy. Now, that's not to be naive, because if I come in saying, hey, I've got my view and let's work together and think of a way forward, and the other person isn't interested in that, they're just like, no, I'm just going to use your openness to collaborate and open yourself to get, to win and get my way. You have to be smart about it, right? It's not in every environment. You have to set these things up. But I think more people that have this alternate view of tensions as natural, as useful, as a source of creative energy, if we can build that orientation and make more spaces where people can come together and share their different worldviews, tech views, and then get into those sort of creative spaces, then I think we find better ways forward.
So as we're closing the episode, I wanted to have just kind of like a question that's kind of has two parts. And the first is that we have this idea that we're going to be working on with Alex, and it's called like the AI challenge. And the whole idea is that we're going to find a way to create some kind of user interface that will actually leverage a model. And then we'll be able for people to fill up a form and say like, we all have, especially when it comes to leaders and thinking about AI, we all have an AI challenge, right? Example of that is like we all have to think about like building up a policy for AI as leaders. So, question for you is like, what is your AI challenge right now? What is the challenge in AI that's in your mind that's a challenge? So, you can share.
Well, and this might not be where you're expecting, but what I like about your example is, here I am saying collectively we need more critical reflection about, our relationships with technology and using that to make, inform wiser action. A fear a lot of people would have in that potentially is, well, I don't have time to go disappear into a cave for a year and meditate on my, before I do anything. And I think what you're describing there is actually like, I think the more productive way to get the both and of action and reflection is, you go out and you try something like like you're talking about with these applications, right? And people who maybe, are a little bit skeptical about AI or different things actually give a shot at a different application, but don't stop there. Like, it's like, all right, what am I learning through this engagement about my tech view and about how it differs from other people's tech views and about the tensions? It's almost like the double click or the double loop learning on what you're doing, because the way to get critical reflection isn't to disappear for a year in a cave. It's to start taking all those opportunities that are around us day to day. When you feel a little uncomfortable about that thing in the news, or when your project team's pulling in a direction and you're not sure why, you go about doing an experiment of using AI on something, right? Like, those are all both forward progress potentially, but also they're both action, hopefully in a forward direction, and their opportunities to critically reflect and sharpen and evolve our own tech views. So over time, our tech view is more and more explicit, more and more kind of refined, and we're making wiser and wiser actions. We've basically built the ability to steer better along with our ability to accelerate.
The next mini question or reflection that I'd like to get from you is, where do you see AI going? Like, how do you see a future of AI? So I had these presentations where I asked people like, are people like leapfroggers? So like, think about like AI is gonna be like, it's gonna leapfrog society and it's gonna be a positive outcome, or are you like the doomsdayer who thinks like, along the lines that I guess kind of like Geoffrey Hinton, he tends to talk about like AI is weapons of mass destruction and things like that. And on the other side, you got like Aidan Gomez from Cohere, who's just all he cares about is like the present moment. It's like AI right now for companies, and let's just customize this model so that you can do some efficiency. Where do you see yourself in terms of like, where do you see yourself within that landscape, and how do you see the AI taking us?
Yeah. So by virtue of the type of work I do, I get to, think about these questions quite a lot. And I think it's interesting that there are experts all over that spectrum, right? That from super optimistic to super pessimistic, and with really good arguments across the whole thing. So I find myself personally feeling more optimistic or pessimistic in different settings and different contexts. But here's like maybe sort of a practical path forward in that. What I'm increasingly listening for is if I hear, someone from Silicon Valley talking really optimistic about tech stewardship, or sorry, about AI, what I've started listening for is the clues about their worldview that are making them feel optimistic, right? And, I'm thinking of one particular, one particular AI leader. And when I hear him talk, his worldview is often like sentient AI is inevitable. It's probably going to be a good thing, and it's probably a good thing to get there sooner than as soon as possible, right? It's like, okay, if I understand, I may or may not agree with that, but rather than sort of like listen to sort of all of his rhetoric up here, I'd rather understand his underlying worldview that's guiding everything he's doing so that I can agree with it or not agree with it. And I have an uncomfortableness with what I see coming out of a lot of Silicon Valley worldviews, where it's the information asymmetry that we talked about before, right? I think it's true when a lot of people in Silicon Valley say, hey, the general public we're not trying to hide this, but the general public just doesn't see what's happening with tech. There's a few of us in the ivory tower who see what's happening in tech, and we need to sort of benevolently take that on and make decisions on behalf of all society. I hear that, like, it's not quite that explicit, but I hear a lot of that coming through as a dominant Silicon Valley worldview, and I don't agree with that, and so it's kind of getting at that double click layer. And similarly, on the other side, on a pessimistic, if I hear people that are, taking really legitimate concerns about things that are happening AI and everything now, and basically saying, therefore, we shouldn't we shouldn't touch AI and we should just throw the brakes on and stop altogether. It's a little bit oversimplified, right? But it's like, okay, again, what's the double click on that worldview that's leading you towards that, and what's in there, right? And so at the end of the day, even if we magically had that worldview conversation with people on either extreme, and maybe we don't agree, the person on Silicon Valley is like, yeah, I hear all your, I hear your tech stewardship view of, we need to understand all these different perspectives and find a way to kind of find the potential within them. But I don't agree. I just think that that's impractical. People aren't going to see technology and it's going to be too slow. I'm pretty sure we would have versions of that conversation with them, right? And but at least we'd be talking about the real essence as opposed to just kind of, chasing our tails a little bit up in like the latest feature that came out and what could this be useful for. That's important. But I think even more important is sort of what's guiding the whole thing. And let's be a little bit more explicit about that.
And we're coming to an end now, and we can likely go on for many, many hours. But I want a final question, kind of just exploring parts of that. Like, we as a society do not handle technology like social media well. We're still struggling to come to grips with it, what it means for democracy, society overall, and so forth. So I often ask myself and others, like, are we mature enough as a society to handle climate change? Are we mature enough to handle what AI's implications are for society? And really, can we learn and be humble enough to adapt? And I'll draw an example back to Norman mentioned Geoffrey Hinton. I found it shocking that he, on the stage 3-4 months ago at the University of Toronto, said that the first time he thought about AI safety was a year ago. So here's the grandfather of AI saying that the first time that he thought about AI safety was a year ago. So he went from one end, being promoting AI and so forth, to really recognizing the need for AI safety, now likely in the other arena. So how do we envision AI being used to bridge the gaps between communities, cultures, and being a positive influence? And just a very small question, if you could change one thing, if you had a magic wand, and not say that everybody magically becomes tech stewards, but what is one thing that you would like to see to influence a positive direction?
Yeah. And maybe getting even a little more explicit than a magic wand, I would invite anyone who's listening to reflect on what is my tech view as part of my worldview. Make it explicit. And how is it different or the same than the tech view of my organization, my sector, my community, Silicon Valley? Like, start practicing that kind of comparison. And then noticing the difference in the tensions between your current view and these other views, and seeing, all right, wait a minute, can I use those tensions as a source of creativity to either evolve my tech view, change my long-term plans or my short-term actions? And so that final step of how do I actually not only make my tech view more explicit and share it and evolve it, but then how do I take action as a part of it? And if I was to use the Geoffrey Hinton kind of example. And I don't know Geoffrey Hinton or Joshua Bengio or the big Canadian names personally. I'm kind of a step removed, but I have a huge respect for that awakening and those questions, right? And it's kind of similar to our work in the engineering change lab. They're coming from, engineering and research and computer science as well too. And you can look at the dominant worldviews of those professions, right? Like, research has this sort of, scientific, like, well, we're just doing pure research, and so there's it's not on us, like how it's used in society and everything. We're like there's a sort of a myth about the scientific method and everything. Well, I shouldn't say myth, because the scientific method is extremely powerful and useful, but it sort of bleeds into an overall worldview that sometimes excuses people from their responsibility for the knowledge they're helping create and curate and bring into the world, right? And so it's when we all, not just, AI and tech, but when we get more aware of our overall worldview and shaped it. Like, my worldview was shaped as an engineer, and the context I came up with was all about creating technology and very little about critical reflection about its impacts. Like, that wasn't, that was never framed to me as part of the natural responsibility of an engineer. There's lots on ethics and responsibility of engineer, but not in that depth and that nuance of sort of, what we now call tech stewardship. And so it's by asking these sort of questions, that the magic wand would be people just pausing and saying, well, wait a minute, what is my view on technology? What is my view of engineering? What is my, and sort of those kind of connections, and just kind of working that in as a habit. So, when you're in that conversation and feeling a tension where you're seeing something out there, again, it's not disappear into a cave. It's just start making that a habit of more and more making explicit what your views are, and then making decisions that are aligned and wiser as a result of being based on that kind of critical reflection and that viewpoint you've cultivated, as opposed to, sort of reactionary to different things around you.
Yeah, and that relates well back to a conversation that we had on the podcast around what lies in opportunities for AI to really rethink how we're educating people and moving from learning what to think to how to think. Because just as a reflection back, when you're talking about a process of reflecting on worldviews or tech views, it's something that you keep coming back to. It's not a one and done thing. It's a continuing, evolving reflection that you have with your nature, with the technology, society's role with the technology. So really just embracing that cyclical coming back and so forth.
Absolutely. And that's, yeah, I can imagine AI going in two very different directions in that, right? Either weaning people off of critical reflection. It's like, oh, don't worry about that. The AI will figure it out. It'll tell you whatever you want to hear. It'll just feed you junk food of the mind. And like it has already with social media, here's a bunch of people who agree with you. Here's what you already wanted to hear. And it actually continues to erode critical reflection in society. Or I could imagine the same base technology being shaped to do the exact opposite. That's actually helping us be more aware of our worldviews, other people's worldviews, and sort of, and the opportunities within them and everything. So I think this is this moment in time. Again, AI has kind of captured our imagination early. Do we use that imagination to bend it, this way or that way? I think the jury's still a little bit out.
I think we're gonna end it here. Thank you so much again, Mark, for coming here, for joining us in episode 3 of this podcast. We have an audience of leaders, people in social impact and philanthropy. Having that in mind, is there anything you would like to share, just as closing off, as a thought, or anything that you would like people to know about?
I mean, just to know that this concept of tech stewardship's emerged over the last 10 years in, from mostly Canadian leaders, is increasingly international, but its roots are in Canada. And it's not an organization, it's not a trademark thing or anything. It's a worldview, it's a practice that's being sort of evolved collaboratively. And if it's something that resonates with people, they're interested, like join the group of us who are developing this kind of, one of the analogies we use is it's kind of like an open source code. There's a bunch of us kind of creating this open source code of a proposed, as people are hopefully starting to challenge themselves to say, well, what is my tech view as part of my worldview? Well, here are some common views of this that we kind of put under this umbrella of tech stewardship, and some common practices that result from that. And it's evolving and changing. And so it's an invitation to anyone who feels compelled by some of these things we've been talking about to join that community that's continuing to evolve this open source code for the benefit of everybody.
Thank you again, and yes, I'm gonna thank everybody for listening. We're gonna put links to Mark and the tech stewardship and all the work he's doing. And yeah, once again, everybody, please share, comment, like, and subscribe to our channels. And we'll be having more of interesting people to talk about in the future. Thanks all.